Uh-huh.
For what?
What we're covering right now.
But what if we don't cover it all?
We're not going to cover it all, but what we cover, we can quiz.
He's gonna give us like 5 questions.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not that much.
Okay.
Although-
He can't really give us all because we don't really
That
have
depends on
20
what we
minutes.
get through.
Yeah, pretty much.
Alrighty, so Asia, yes, it's a big place. Generally, I would wax poetic about this for a few minutes, but we don't really have time for all that mess.
Ain't no one got time for that. So let's talk about specifics, why don't we?
Generally speaking, when we break up Asia, we tend to look at it at East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Western Asia, Central Asia, and Russia. It's a lot of different places. The reason for that generally is physical features. For instance, this, by the way, what we're looking at right here is Western Asia. Someone says this region, think Western Asia, aka the Middle East. As many different mountain ranges, such as the Zagros, the Elburz, and the Taurus, as well as many different waterways, which is weird because most people think, Middle East, Arabian Peninsula, desert, and you'd be right, except not all of the Middle East is actually desert. In fact, there's quite a few areas that are very green and Mediterranean. The Suez Canal, for instance, is the most important waterway in this area of the world. It essentially cuts the Africa leg of the trip between Europe and Asia off. So if you think about it, before the Suez Canal, if you want to go from Europe, you had to sail all the way around Africa. Now you just cut through that into the Red Sea and so on and so forth. I thought that was going to happen at some point. I'll get that up for you.
The last word.
Yeah, well, I'm recording it right now too, so you guys have to come back and take that spot too. But just because this projector is right about to explode.
That could be a good thing.
Well, not literally. It's not literally going to just turn into fragments. It's not loaded with gunpowder after all. But it is going to stop functioning as a projector. It was really badly designed, as long as short. Anyways, but it does tend to be pretty dry and hospitable in the Arabian Peninsula. That's where most people's vision of the Middle East comes from. Of course, the peoples have settled in this area and have developed technologies to do so. For instance, in Iran, which was old Persia, they developed an irrigation system called the Qanats system, or Qanat, which allowed certain areas to be settled and big cities to develop. Interestingly enough, there are cities out in the middle of the freaking desert that are just abandoned now because when the Mongols came into this area, they destroyed the Qanat system and essentially depopulated towns, and they were never settled again, so they're literally ghost towns. In addition, if you look at water and how it moves in the desert, there's some pretty interesting phenomena that occur. For instance, there's these things called wadis, W-A-D-I. They are dry riverbeds that, in some instances, in some occasions, during the wet season, will become rivers. And whenever it's during the dry season, they just dry up and disappear. There are instances of rivers moving, and it's just all kinds of neat stuff. But for the most part, the peoples have had to adapt to this region. We'll get more in how that affects actually people every day, but for the most part, this has a pretty tremendous effect. In the desert, water is life. This is true today as much as any other time. But this also means that as a scarce resource, it tends to be very heavily sought and bought over. Water resources are traditionally where we get some of these spat between various tribes and clans. And really, if you look at a lot of the ethnic groups and sort of the tensions in this region of the world, that's where they stem from. Of course, the main method that people got water was rivers. And in particular, there are two very, very, very important rivers in this region of the world, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers.
Those are cool names.
Mm-hmm.
what are they?
Give me just a second, and I'll show you. I'm just letting you guys finish up this slide.
So you already know about it.
Yeah, it's the next one. The area in between those rivers, which is part of a greater system known as the Fertile Crescent, is known as Mesopotamia. Literally the land between the rivers, the land in the middle of the two rivers. That area has been settled going back centuries. And interesting enough, if you look at the first really big civilizations, that the first ones on this planet, that's where they started. That's why it's called the Fertile Crescent. If you think about it, you need a couple things if you're going to stay in one place. Traditionally people hunt and gather. Yes, they move and follow the animals and they pick up whatever crops they can. If you're going to stay in one place, you need water and you need land that's good for growing crops. Well, between these two rivers, you obviously have water, but that alluvial soil, like we mentioned with the Nile, means this area is very rich and fertile. It's very good for growing crops. And so these cities developed along the rivers and grew into civilizations. It's actually kind of an interesting phenomenon that you can replicate in the game Minecraft. You guys have ever played Minecraft?
Yeah.
Okay, so what happens is, every now and again, someone will set up a server and just invite people, and we're going to play Minecraft together, right? And what happens is you have a bunch of people, they start immediately just leveling forests and going and building houses and gathering resources and things like that. And eventually, what happens is somebody's going to get a little upset because someone took some resources they want. Maybe they go burn their house down or something like that. In return, maybe that player attacks them. So someone has to step in and say, okay, here's the rules to the server, right? You can't attack each other. You cannot take each other's things. You cannot burn each other's houses. It sets a system of rules that you have to obey or you get kicked out of the server, yeah? That's essentially laws. That's where laws come from. If you think about it, kicking someone out of a server is sort of a macabre rendition of the death penalty, because you're literally ending someone's life on the server, yes? And if you look at early laws, such as the Hammurabi's Code, you guys studied that at all? Okay, Hammurabi's Code is really one of the oldest systems of law we're aware of. And it's very, very primitive. It's very, very basic. The general idea is trying to achieve balance by having the same thing happen to the perpetrator of a crime. So, for instance, if you steal something, either they take something of equal value from you, or if you don't have anything, they chop your hand off. Okay? If you build a house and it collapses because you were negligent and kill somebody, they kill you by dropping a ton of rocks on you. If you get in a fist fight and you punch someone and you knock their teeth out, they punch your teeth out. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That's where that comes from, yeah. So what happens is, this early system of law develops over time as civilization develops. Because the thing is, early on, the technology isn't there to have a wide, big, immense civilization. You need technology for that to function. This is actually one of the interesting things when you look at, for instance, the United States democracy. If you think about it, democracy relies on communication and information. For us to vote and do so knowledgeably, we have to know quite a lot of information. We have that at our fingertips. We live in an information age. We're using devices you guys create all the time. You can find out how to do anything. I mean, literally. You're like, I need to know how to, change this part of my car. You can look at it on YouTube and show exactly how to do it. It's amazing in the age we live in when it comes to that sort of thing. But back then, you really don't have that. And furthermore, there's just not the population for this. So what tends to happen in the earliest civilizations, which are known as river civilizations, because they developed on these two rivers, they tend to be rather small. In fact, they're frequently only one city. For instance, if you look at the old civilizations, like Assyria, Babylon, even kind of going out west where you end up with folks like Athens and Greece and
actually not so much Greece because that's not a thing. Um, Ur, Asher, Elba, Damascus, all these different places. They're all cities that are states. They're city-states. As an aside, do you guys know the difference between a nation and a state? Did you cover that in the first section? Okay. So nation, we say like one nation under God, okay? Nation refers to a group of people with a shared common cultural background. For instance, if you say we are a nation, it means we are one people.
A shared
Shared culture, shared ethnicity, basically a shared system of culture. Is really kind of yeah, no, I'm not going to ask you that. Whereas a state is a political union, political body with territory and can put treaties, and it's a governmental body. So when we say that it is a city-state, we're talking that it's a country that is one city. We wouldn't say nation-state, not in that particular instance, because that infers that it is a political body made up of one real culture. And while to some extent that is true of these city-states, there's also quite a lot of movement in this area of the world. So that's not really that accurate. Now, people can argue whether the United States is a nation-state because of a lot of different things, but we won't talk about that. But the primary difference, the thing I really want you to take away from that, is nation refers to culture, state refers to government. Okay? Now, that can also be confusing because we have the United States, we're a bunch of states. That stems from the earliest part of our government's history where the states were sort of like countries of their own. We just happened to have one big organizational body that was the federal government. But the original establishment of the United States was one where that federal government was super weak, and actually was so bad we almost had a civil war between all the various states. And so essentially the Constitution was written to try to stem that problem, and it worked. It's backpaging. So I said the first river civilizations that developed have famous names. Especially if you go and read the Old Testament, a lot of these guys will crop up. Now this green area shows the Fertile Crescent. It's called Fertile Crescent because it sort of makes this crescent shape. And it's this area where the first civilizations go. You'll notice we have Jerusalem in here, this biblical area, this part right in here, in the green, as well as Canaan. We have Syria. We have all these different red city-states. And the reason they saw there is because that's where the rivers were. That was Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. The Tigris is in the north, the Euphrates is in the south, and in between that, we have this green area. Now, generally speaking, we'll sometimes connect that all the way down to the Nile because this is also part of this greater Fertile Crescent. But for the most part, as far as raw materials in this area, of course, most folks think of it, at least they think oil. And indeed, it is a tremendous source of income for some of these countries. Yes, we know. But there's others as well. For instance, this area has been renowned for its steel going back centuries. Damascus steel is renowned historically as being some of the strongest, some of the best steel in the world. And weirdly enough, to this day, we can't replicate it. We don't really know how they did this. We have something close called pattern welding steel, But pattern welding, or essentially, pattern welding is where you take, hang on, it's been a while since I've looked into this and how you do it. I haven't had a tape on how to do it, but it's essentially where you take layers of different bars of steel and you sandwich them together and you put an acid in between them that keeps it from rusting through the forging process, and then you forge it into one bar of steel, one filament. From that point, you can make whatever shape, whatever you want out of it. And why it's called pattern welded steel is with the folding process involved into blending these steels, when you actually finish the product, the blade itself has this really neat pattern etched into the surface. It makes a pretty strong steel. And interestingly enough, it's not because it's a better way of making steel. Actually, there's much better ways that we can use modern technology to make steel. But for the time when steel was really hard to make into something, you know, it makes it worthwhile. Great example of this, actually, is if you compare two different swords. Actually, let me get 3 blades out that we can talk about and give you an idea of some of these different things. We have 3 different weapons from different periods in history, right? Historically speaking, steel was really, really hard to manufacture. For instance, this spearhead is enormous and came out of a different era. This is actually from the top of a spear called an Ikwa. It was what was used by the Zulu in the 19th century. And generally speaking, this is really, really, really big. Most spearheads are only about like that big. And the reason is that that's pretty easy to manufacture. You don't need that much steel, and you can make them en masse. A sword, though, needs a lot more steel to produce. And so you have something like this from the ancient Greeks in the early Iron Age. This is called a xiphos, which is a very kind of short, leaf-bladed sword. And you'll notice there's not actually that much steel into it, but that's because, again, producing something like this took a lot of effort and time. As technology increased, as we could get more steel, swords grew bigger. This is a oak shot type 7 sword, and you'll see it's a lot bigger. But this is still considered a short sword because a longer sword, yea, long, but would require 2 handholds, takes, yet again, a lot more steel. And the fighting techniques that you use with these changed over time to reflect the type of weapon that's being used and also the type of armor that's available. Because for the most part, whenever you're going against the earliest days of armor, something like that is you're not going to see it. Most steel armor for history is going to change pretty dramatically as the weapons change because there's a sort of give and take between the two. Earliest armors were essentially leather, and that's because the type of weapons you're coming across are spears, arrows, and something like this. It's meant to deflect slashing attacks, but if you just really go into it with a point, it's not really going to do much for you. Over time, they developed ring mail, which is essentially wire bound into rings and then woven into a chain pattern. That's actually what this is right over here. This is a type of chainmail that's pretty ubiquitous for the era. It's called 4-in-1 because there's 4 rings on the outside and 1 on the inside. And this is really good at, deflecting slashing attacks. If you're hacking at somebody, you're not going to be able to cut them through that. Now again, if you put the blade in and give it the beans, you're going to get to those rings. Remind me, we'll talk more about it tomorrow. Shut these down.
How many questions do you think they're going to be able to have?
5. It's a quiz, not a test.
I know, that's what I told them.
Yeah, it's just a quiz, and it's going to be 5 questions. I would recommend knowing the different rivers and some of these terms we talked about, such as Mesopotamia, what that means. Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers. I would know about some of the resources we talked about. No, it wasn't. I mentioned it. Same as Tigris and Euphrates, that sort of thing.